everyone. Happy Friday. It's good to see you. I hope you are enjoying your morning, your afternoon, your evening, wherever you are. I am Kelly O'Neill. I'm a historian and the director of the Imperia Project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. In today's episode of Degrees, Minutes, Seconds, I want to tell you about a place that is so small and so seemingly inconsequential that it is almost impossible to find it on a map. It's called Snake Island. So it is not often that an island in an unknown sea emerges from utter obscurity overnight to become one of the most famous places on Earth. But that is exactly what happened to a very small rocky outcropping in the Black Sea near the mouth of the Danube River in February 2022. Even if you aren't following Russia's war against Ukraine closely, you probably heard about the response of the Ukrainian border guard to threat of bombardment by 2 Russian naval ships that had just approached the island. Famously, he said, "Russian warship, go, F yourself." And it is a quote for the ages. And it was uttered by a man standing on Snake Island. So Snake Island, right? It sounds sinister, at least if you aren't a great lover of snakes. And we'll come back to the snakes, I promise. But let's set them aside for a minute or two and talk a little bit about the island and why it matters. First of all, it's an island in a sea, the Black Sea, that is otherwise without islands. The Mediterranean, by contrast, the Black Sea's nearest neighbor, is littered with islands, right? Crete, Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Malta, etc. You get the idea. The Black Sea has nothing but a scattering of little rocky outcroppings and sandbars that might or might not count properly as islands. Now, as it happens, a bunch of these small places are named after animals. We have Bird Island and Crocodile Island off the Bulgarian coast. And elsewhere we have the Oyster Islands, the Swan Islands, and even among the islands, right, places called islands that are not named for animals. They're all relatively important habitats for wildlife. The islands of the Black Sea, these small, unimpressive islands, are home to wild boar, deer, whelk, shrimp. Giresun Island off the Turkish coast is famous for its cormorants as well as its laurel trees, right? And the Danubian Islands, there's a collection of very small islands off the coast of the mouth of the Danube River, are pelican habitats. They're home to egrets, herons, stork, swans, right? And it was the birds, actually, who gave Snake Island its original name. Snake Island didn't start out life as Snake Island. It was once White Island. It was white because there were the swarms of seafowl, of birds that lived on the island were so significant that it made the island visible from afar to mariners. The feathers and wings of the birds made the island white. The island itself is essentially about 1 mile in circumference. It has very sharp cliffs that range from about 50 feet to 100 feet on all of their sides, and it's surrounded by deep water. It is off the coast of the Danube River, the mouth of the Danube, which the mouth of the Danube is a really interesting place. It's about 50 miles long, and nowhere along that mouth is there anything that's more than about 2 feet above sea level, which means that if you are a mariner who's trying to approach the Danube from the Black Sea, it's really, really difficult to know when you're close to shore and to know how to get into one of the navigable channels of the Danube. So this island, this white island, became an incredibly important site for mariners throughout history. It still is, but certainly in ancient times. Pindar writes about it. Euripides writes about it. They all call it the White Island, and it was so important that it came to be associated with no less a character than Achilles himself. It was rumored to be Achilles' last known residence. And in the 2nd century, so there was this long association, right, with Achilles, the hero. In the 2nd century AD, it was described by Arrian in a letter to Emperor Hadrian of Hadrian's Wall fame. And Snake Island was described at that point as uninhabited except by goats. And the goats were known to have been brought to White Island as votive offerings to Achilles. The island apparently was also home to all kinds of other offerings and sacred gifts, right? So vases and rings and precious gems. It was known in the early centuries of the Common Era that this was a place where people would go not only to leave offerings, but to read inscriptions aloud. And they would read inscriptions in Greek and Latin in various meters, all in honor of Achilles and Patroclus, who was also worshipped at the site. So this place, automatically we know that despite its kind of meager size, it has importance to mariners, and it certainly has this sacred meaning in the ancient world into Roman times. The island did go uninhabited for centuries, right? It was a waypoint. It was a marker. It was the object that made passage from the Black Sea into the Danube possible. And at some point, it was given a new name, Fidonisi. It's a Greek name. And in the 18th century, so if we fast forward a bit ahead, right, into the Ottoman period, it was the Greeks who gave it this name, Fidonisi. And in the 18th century, which is kind of when Snake Island reappears in the historical record, as unlikely as it may seem, this island that was barely an island became the focal point for naval warfare among empires. Right? There was a famous Battle of Fidonisi between the Russians and the Ottomans in 1788. And really from that point forward, Fidonisi, the island of serpents, essentially as it translates, was on the map as a place of imperial contestation, primarily between the Russians and the Ottomans, but other players soon came into the mix too. If we fast forward from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, we come to the next moment when Snake Island plays an important role. It was the rendezvous site for the Allied fleet in September of 1854 as the Crimean War was really getting underway. And we have notes from British naval officers describing the prodigious fleet of transport and steamer vessels with tens of thousands of soldiers all anchored off the coast of Snake Island, off Fidonisi, all awaiting word that it was time to invade the Crimean coast. So we have automatically these linkages historically between the Mediterranean world, the greater Black Sea world, right, the Russian and Ottoman spaces, and Crimea, right, the linkage between the coast of the Danube River, the western coast of the Black Sea, and Crimea. So by this point, by the middle of the 19th century, the place was known to all as Fidonisi and as the Island of Serpents. And there were supposedly absurd stories that were circulating. These rumors would circulate among Ottoman and Russian mariners about the snakes. There was one particular story held that 4 men from a Russian ship that had wrecked off the coast sought refuge from the shipwreck and climbed up on the island. And no sooner had they landed than encountered a worse enemy than the sea and were all devoured by serpents. As you can imagine, mariners tend to be superstitious, and stories like this are really fun to spread. And by the time of the Crimean War, the place was associated very significantly with snakes. And interestingly enough, we get really detailed reports produced by British naval officers who were participating in the Crimean War. So Captain Thomas Abel Brimage Spratt, Captain Spratt, was captain of the HMS Medina. And he's really one of the best sources that we have for the maritime history of the Black Sea in the 19th century, at least in the 1850s. And among other things, Captain Spratt confirmed that the island was indeed inhabited by sea serpents, or water snakes, that fed on fish and then climbed up and lived on the rocks. And Spratt reported that the serpents were jet black, 4 to 5 feet long, and harmless, though disagreeable looking. The real problem, you could see them kind of coiling together, and he reports seeing dozens coiled together in the rocks, sunning themselves. The real problem, the real danger posed by these sea serpents wasn't so much that they could actually devour a man. The problem was that they were known to fall into the wells of fresh water on Snake Island, and their bodies would there decompose and render the water no longer drinkable and actually quite dangerous to drink. For Spratt, a ship captain, a naval captain, Snake Island wasn't just a place important because of stories and snakes, right? Pratt describes the island as, and I will quote him here, the eye of the Danube. And I think it's worth lingering on the short report that he presented to the British Admiralty in 1857. Spratt tells us that the island of serpents was surrounded by deep water on all sides, which meant that ships could really easily approach and anchor. And Spratt had an eye for detail. So he notes in his report that the seabed was all mussel shells and mud, right? Easy for an anchor to catch. And when he found the best landing site, he took the time, he noticed a path that had been cut into the stone. It was a terraced road that had been built in ancient times. So he describes the road, and he followed the road up to the top of the promontory, so the flat surface of the island. And from there, Spratt could look out onto the sea, but he could also look down. He looked down, and he found that he wasn't standing just on grass or stone or crushed shell, as you might expect on an island like this. He was standing on a surface almost composed entirely of fragments of ancient pottery, right? Pieces of vases and amphora, all lying in great profusion. And it was clear that some other people before him had come seeking objects of value there. They had come probably seeking coins and jewelry, and hadn't found, because of all the myths of the offerings to Achilles. They didn't find those things. Instead, they found all of this pottery and seemed to have smashed the pottery in their frustration. And so Spratt bent down and found fragments with Greek inscriptions on them. He found painted pieces, black pieces, red pieces, the kind of signature marks of Greek pottery. There were pieces that were decorated with animals and ornamental designs, and he found countless handles of water jugs, right? So he goes on, so there's this proof of people living on the island and needing to drink, right? Elsewhere on the island, he found the remnants of property walls, and he knew, standing there in 1856, that once, maybe 1,500 years prior, the island had been inhabited and cultivated. He dug into the earth and found rich black soil going down 2 to 3 feet deep. So the island had supported human life, right? It had been a productive space, a sacred space, and very much a contested space. Along with the rest of the Black Sea, Snake Island had been Ottoman territory. Fidenisi had been Ottoman territory. In 1829, Russia had won a war against the Ottomans, and Fidenisi had become Russian territory. And when that happened, the Russian Navy built a lighthouse on the island in 1842. And it stayed there, and Fidenisi stayed Russian in a sense, until Russia's crushing defeat in the Crimean War. And according to the terms of the Treaty of Paris that in 1856, Russia had to relinquish control of the island. And Turkish sailors, as soon as this became known, the very first thing that Ottoman sailors did was scramble back to Fidenisi and install a beautiful revolving light in the lighthouse. They did this right away. And it was a very intentional action that asserted or kind of reconfirmed the claim of the Ottomans to the space, right, by marking the lighthouse. The Russian Navy actually didn't want this to happen and made a concerted attempt to beat the Turkish sailors to the island. The English were observing the whole thing, and they decided actually to double down and triple down on the terms of the Treaty of Paris and sent the British fleet back into the Black Sea for the express purpose of preventing the Russians from taking the island. And so it was the Turkish soldiers, the Ottoman soldiers, who reasserted control over Snake Island. By the late 1870s, the island was actually recognized as Romanian. There's a whole history to that as well. And it remained Romanian space until after World War II, until 1948, when it was ceded to the Soviet Union. So again, like when you start unpacking this history of this tiny space, you see this constant contestation over territory in this geostrategically significant maritime region, right? So the Soviets, Snake Island becomes Soviet territory in 1948. Romania never gives up its claim. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses and control was ceded to Ukraine, Ukraine inherited this dispute with Romania, along with inheriting the island. Snake Island is small, right? It's 22 miles from the Ukrainian coast. It is a heap of jet black snakes and pottery shards. It has a lighthouse built on top of an ancient temple to Achilles. The lighthouse is still there. There's nowhere to hide on this island, right? Which is something that the Ukrainian border guards were well aware of in February 2022. Captain Spratt was one in a long line of mariners who defined the island and continue to define this island as a sea beacon, right? The eye of the Danube, the place for finding passage from the Black Sea into the Great River of Europe. Right? It's too small to show up on most maps. It's barely an island, but it's no accident that it was one of the first targets in Russia's war against Ukraine, because this place has history, and possessing the island means taking control of the narrative. That's my story about Snake Island. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Degrees, Minutes, Seconds. Take good care.